When you look at your life, the decisions you make, the patterns you can't seem to break, the wounds that still ache beneath the surface, it's easy to trace them back to major events, key relationships, successes, or failures. But if you dig a little deeper, beneath all the noise of grown-up life, you'll almost always hit the same bedrock: your mother. Carl Jung understood this better than most. To him, the mother isn't just a person. She's an archetype, a symbol that represents the most foundational psychological imprint in a person's life. She is the first source of nourishment, safety, care, and love. But she's also the first source of fear, rejection, shame, and grief. And regardless of the specific dynamic you had, whether she was present or absent, nurturing or cold, overprotective or emotionally detached, her energy is embedded in the roots of who you are. And not just your childhood self, all of you. That's the terrifying and liberating part. Most people believe their mother's influence stops somewhere in adolescence. That at some point you move on, grow up, separate. But you don't. Not really. The attachment may shift. The relationship may evolve. But the pattern remains. The way your mother looked at you, how she responded to your emotions, how she loved or didn't love, you formed the blueprint for how you perceive yourself and how you show up in the world. But here's where it goes beneath psychology and starts bleeding into power. Because this kind of influence isn't passive. It shapes how your unconscious sees reality. It becomes the lens through which you measure worth, form connections, handle rejection, or seek validation. You are constantly replaying the inner drama of your earliest emotional experiences, most of them tied to her. The way she smiled when you performed, or the silence she gave when you failed. The anger in her voice, the pride in her eyes, or the emptiness you learned to accept. Those aren't just memories. They became the source code for what love means to you, what safety feels like, what being good enough sounds like. That's not just impactful, it's powerful. And that brings us to another thinker who saw human relationships through the lens of control rather than comfort. Niccolò Machiavelli. While Jung dove into unconscious patterns, Machiavelli examined the use of power in relationships. From his viewpoint, influence matters more than intent. A person may not intend to manipulate, but if they hold emotional weight in your psyche, especially from such a young age, they hold tremendous control over your inner narrative. So when you combine Jung and Machiavelli, you get something dangerous and profound. The realization that your mother didn't just hold you. She helped write the script of your reality. And not always in words, sometimes in looks, in tone, in silence, in what she praised and what she punished. All of that lives inside of you now, ticking quietly like an old clock. If you've ever found yourself chasing someone's approval, or sabotaging intimacy, or doubting your worth at the height of your success, don't look at the outside world for explanations. Look inward. Ask which part of your mother's gaze still lives inside you. Ask why her approval, or lack thereof, still echoes in the choices you make. Because chances are the version of you that you perform in the world was shaped in response to her eyes. This doesn't mean your mother was malicious. It doesn't mean she intended to harm you. Sometimes the damage comes from love that was too tight, a grip that never let go. Sometimes it comes from love that never arrived, or worse, from unpredictability. A mother who could flood you with warmth one day and freeze you in ice the next. That instability, that ambiguity, what Jung would describe as the good mother and the terrible mother, combining into one, creates psychological fractures that follow people for decades. Because you're always trying to earn what was held, or recreate what felt familiar, even if it hurt. The tragic part is how invisible this all is to most people. They might think their struggle is falling for emotionally distant partners, or never feeling enough at work, or never trusting love fully, but they don't see the origin, the very first moment the self was reflected back to them through someone else's expression. That's what your mother gave you, consciously or not, your first mirror. And it's in that mirror that you learned to either recognize yourself or split yourself into pieces just to stay safe or accepted. That's why healing isn't about blaming her. It's about recognizing the archetype she played in your story, and then deciding if you're still living by that story without realizing. It's about revisiting those early reflections and asking, was that asterisk really asterisk me? Or was that just what I needed to be so she would love me, so I could survive? Because that question changes everything. From the outside, a mother's love is often idealized, sacred, even untouchable. We grow up surrounded by images of maternal warmth, unconditional support, gentle nurture, endless sacrifice. And sometimes that's real. But more often than we dare admit, the emotional bond between mother and child is complex, layered, and, at times, manipulative. Not always consciously, not cruelly, but strategically. And if we're being honest, it makes sense. A mother, just like anyone else, is human. She comes with her own wounds, fears, unmet needs, and generational imprints. And sometimes those get passed down not just through what she says, but through how she survives, how she controls, and how she connects. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He believed that the emotional dynamics in early relationships, especially with our mothers, form the core of our unconscious patterns. But to see it through a more strategic lens, through the eyes of Machiavelli, is to notice something less sentimental and far more sobering. Emotional power is still power. And power, when used without awareness or balance, becomes control. Control not through direct commands, but through tools far more subtle and effective. Guilt, obligation, silence, approval, the withholding of love. These are not things you're taught to recognize as manipulation. In fact, they're often encouraged. She just wants what's best for you, people say. But sometimes, what's best is entangled with what she needs from you. This starts at the earliest stages of life, where your developing sense of self depends entirely on her emotional cues. If you're met with warmth when you're quiet but ignored when you're loud, you learn very quickly which version of yourself is preferred. If you're praised when you succeed but made to feel like a burden when you fail, a pattern takes root. Love must be earned. If silence follows your pain but attention follows your compliance, a part of you shuts down before you even learn the words to name it. This is how emotional control begins, quietly, invisibly. It doesn't come with threats, it comes with patterns. Repeated enough times, those patterns become your internal compass. You start navigating life not by who you are, but by who you had to be to maintain harmony with your mother's emotional needs. That may have meant becoming the peacemaker, the high achiever, the caretaker, the invisible one. These roles aren't consciously assigned, they are slowly absorbed. And decades later, you find yourself playing them in your relationships, in your career, in your silence. Now, none of this means your mother was consciously manipulative or malicious. In fact, that's what makes this so difficult. She may have truly believed she was doing everything in love, and maybe she was doing her best, passing you strategies she had to use to survive herself. But when seen through a Machiavellian lens, it becomes clear that intent doesn't erase effect. The reality is that emotional power, especially when tied to survival, validation, or identity, creates dependency. And dependency that isn't examined becomes a breeding ground for unconscious control. This kind of control doesn't disappear as you grow. It just evolves. You may think you're independent now, living your own life, making your own decisions, but if you never examined the emotional contract you inherited from your mother, chances are you're still living by it. You may still feel the need to please women in authority, avoid conflict in relationships, or sacrifice your truth to protect someone else's feelings. And somewhere, if you're brutally honest with yourself, there's a moment when you realize, I'm still trying to keep her happy, even when she's no longer in the room. Guilt becomes a leash. Obligation becomes a chain. The fear of disappointing her, whether she's alive, distant, or long gone, still affects your choices. This is the weight of emotional control. It doesn't scream, it whispers, it suggests, it triggers discomfort when you take steps that threaten the old dynamic. And unless you bring it into the light, it governs you from the shadows. Here's the irony: though breaking free doesn't mean rejecting her, it doesn't even mean confronting her, it means confronting yourself. It means asking who you became because of the emotional rules she set in place. It means noticing when guilt enters the room and questioning whether that guilt is yours or inherited. It means recognizing when your silence feels safer than your truth and choosing to speak anyway. This kind of clarity is difficult, even painful, but it's also essential, because until you see the ways emotional control has shaped your internal world, you'll keep mistaking self-abandonment for love. You'll keep choosing roles over authenticity. You'll repeat the dynamic you had with her, with lovers, bosses, children, friends, because that's the only way you know how to relate. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And fate, in this case, looks like you chasing freedom while still bound by emotional debts you never agreed to owe. Because freedom doesn't begin when she lets go. It begins when you do. Growing up, most of us never realize we're building a mask. We're too young, too dependent, too desperate for love to see what's happening. All we know is what gets approval and what gets punished. What brings connection and what brings distance. Whether we were the golden child, the peacemaker, the rebel, or the invisible one, we shaped ourselves in reaction to what our mother could or could not hold. It wasn't a choice, it was survival. And the saddest part is that somewhere along the way, most of us confused that version of ourselves with who we really are. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we create to function in society, to be accepted, to play the role that makes others comfortable. But before we ever wear it for the world, we wear it at home. We develop it to meet the needs of the very first emotional authority we ever knew, the mother. And often without realizing it, we become entertainers for her affection, caretakers of her emotional state, peacekeepers for her unresolved trauma. We learn to suppress the inconvenient parts of ourselves: anger, sadness, vulnerability, because they threaten the stability of the bond we're subconsciously trying to protect. When that happens, we aren't just repressing emotions, we're performing. We take on a role that earns us safety or affection, and that role becomes our identity. The tragedy is that the more consistent the performance, the more disconnected we become from our real self. Over the years, discovery turns to adaptation, and authenticity gets substituted for approval. The self that could have been, the one full of contradictions, flaws, depth, and truth, gets buried beneath layers of behavior conditioned by someone else's emotional limitations. This isn't about blame, it's about understanding, because it's easy to reduce this to parent bashing, but it's so much more nuanced than that. Most mothers don't set out to mold false identities in their children. In fact, Many are simply reenacting their own unconscious survival strategies. Generations of women who were told to be quiet, be good, be small. Generations who had to sacrifice their authenticity to meet expectations, and now hand down those same unspoken rules because that's all they know. It's not cruelty, it's continuation. It's how emotional dynamics echo from one life to the next, unless someone has the courage to stop and ask, asterisk, who am I without the role I was trained to play? Asterisk, Machiavelli may not have written about mothers, but he deeply understood the nature of masks. He understood that power lies in perception, that people wear roles to protect themselves, control outcomes, and preserve peace. The same can be said of the false self a child creates in the presence of emotional power. If you learned that being difficult made love disappear, you became agreeable. If your needs were ignored, you learned not to have them. If your emotional expression was too much, you learned to shut down. And this works for a while. It avoids conflict. It earns praise. It keeps the mother-child bond intact. But it comes at a cost. That cost is the internal fracture between who you are and who you had to be. The voice that second guesses your every decision, the self-doubt that follows every success, the emptiness that lingers even when you're doing everything right. It's not because something is broken. It's because something essential has been hidden. The repression of the real self doesn't just disappear with age. It festers. It shows up in your relationships, attracting partners who mirror your mother's emotional patterns. It surfaces in your work, chasing perfection to keep the praise coming. It haunts your peace, the feeling that you're constantly performing, even when you're alone. This is where Jung's mirror becomes so important. He knew healing begins when we stop organizing our lives around the parts of us we believe are lovable, and instead integrate the parts we were told weren't. That's shadow work. It's sitting with the anger you were never allowed to feel, the sadness you had to swallow, the truth you had to silence. It's realizing that the false self you built to survive is no longer helping you live. It sounds simple, but it's terrifying. Because that false self protected you for years, letting go of it can feel like losing everything. Your structure, your image, even your sense of purpose. But it's the only way to truly come home to yourself. Once you see where the mask began, you can begin to loosen it. You can start asking yourself questions without fear of the answers. Who would I be if I didn't need her approval? What would I feel if I wasn't trying to keep the peace? What parts of myself have I never even met, because I was too busy performing someone else's version of me? You don't have to destroy the role you played. You only need to separate it from your identity. Honor it as something you created to survive, and then choose day by day to reconnect with the self you buried beneath it. That self may feel unfamiliar at first, but it's still there, beneath the persona, beneath the performance, beneath the silence. Because healing isn't about fixing who you've become. It's about remembering who you were before the role. There comes a moment, sometimes early, sometimes much later in life, when the mask starts to feel heavy. It's not obvious at first. You just feel tired in a way that rest doesn't fix. Relationships don't feel as satisfying. Success doesn't feel as rewarding. And somewhere in the quiet between distractions, there's a growing sense that something about your life doesn't quite belong to you. That feeling is your shadow calling. It's everything you've repressed, hidden, or abandoned in order to be who you thought you had to be first for your mother, then for the world. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the collection of traits, truths, impulses, and emotions we've pushed into the unconscious because they didn't fit the narrative we were taught to live. And Machiavelli while typically associated with political power, understood one thing with chilling clarity. Control begins where truth ends. The less you know about yourself, the easier it is for others, parents, institutions, ideologies, to shape your choices, manipulate your desires, and reroute your path long before you realize you're not walking your own road. The shadow, then, isn't just personal. It's where your untapped power lives. And the longer it remains buried, the more it governs you from the dark. So what does this have to do with your mother? Everything, because it's in our relationship with our mothers, our first mirror, our first container for love and shame, that much of the shadow is formed. The things we weren't allowed to feel or were too afraid to express didn't disappear. They sank. Maybe it was the anger you swallowed because she couldn't handle your rage. Maybe it was the rebellion you buried because you were too scared to be rejected. Maybe it was the deep need for affection you had to deny because she only praised independence. Each of those fragments has been living inside you, growing in the dark, quietly directing your choices from behind the scenes. This is why no real healing happens without shadow work. Therapy is helpful, insight is powerful, but until you're willing to confront the parts of yourself that your early conditioning forced you to suppress, especially the parts born in reaction to your mother's energy, you'll keep cycling through patterns that feel unsolvable. You'll keep attracting people who activate the same wounds. You'll sabotage opportunities that threaten your false stability. You'll feel disconnected from any version of yourself that feels fully alive, because aliveness includes everything *. Even what you were taught was unacceptable. Shadow work is often misunderstood. It's not about blaming your mom. It's not about rage or rejection. It's about reclaiming what you had to abandon. It's about facing the parts of yourself that scared her. Not just you. And when you do that honestly, when you let those parts speak instead of silence them, you begin to understand that much of your power was never truly gone. It was just hidden. The self you had to build to survive may have served a purpose, but it was born from limitation. The mother's fear of losing control, of being alone, of not being needed, all of that gets transferred subtly to the child. You adapt to keep harmony. You learn her needs before your own. That's how the roles are passed down. And then life happens, and you find yourself still living by a script that was written for you not by conscious intention, but by emotional necessity. The reclamation starts by going back, not to live in the past, but to retrieve the parts of you left there. Grief, anger, longing, and unspoken truth are not signs of weakness. They are markers from the trail you were forced to leave behind when you traded authenticity for acceptance. By revisiting those moments with your adult perspective with awareness, you rewrite the contract. You no longer exist inside the mold your mother needed. You learn to hold yourself in the places she couldn't, and it's not just symbolic, it's physical, it's emotional. You speak the words you were afraid to say out loud. You give your inner child the permission she never had. You stop filtering your desires through someone else's comfort zone. This kind of work isn't poetic. It's gritty. It takes patience, self-honesty, and the courage to disappoint others in order to be honest with yourself. But what waits on the other side isn't just healing. It's freedom. Not the kind of freedom that feels loud or dramatic. The kind that feels quiet and deep, like exhaling for the first time in years. Like having enough space in your body to feel again. Not just perform, tolerate, or hustle. It's strange at first, because you're so used to being what others needed. But slowly, the pieces return. Your voice softens, not because you're weak, but because you're no longer guarding. Your choices align, not because you're trying to prove something, but because you're finally choosing from center. And that's what makes this whole journey worth it. You weren't meant to live as her reflection. You were meant to become whole.